Verdi takes us through all aspects of human existence, essentially, all aspects of the great traditions of requiems, from individual prayer, individual rumination on our own souls, to the very famous, we'll play a section of the famous Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, which has been a source of incredibly powerful music for composers from Mozart to Cherubini to Berlioz, and ultimately here to Verdi. And yet at the end of the entire piece, it almost ends with a question mark. The idea that a soul has been granted eternal life, which is ostensibly the end of a requiem, is to send this soul off to this wonderful eternal life somewhere. And yet the end of this piece very much does not do that. It seems to get there, and in the final movement, the Libera Me, the chorus repeatedly intones in this incredibly complex and almost desperate kind of fugue this text, Libera Me, deliver me, O Lord, from eternal death. And almost desperate in their plea for this, and yet at the end, it dies away. And the final words we hear, both by the solo soprano and then the chorus intoned, is just this almost whispered, very solemn, Libera me, deliver me. And it's as if the question is still being asked. And in a certain sense, the idea that the hope of this eternal existence has somehow disappeared. We hear this descent. And the chorus intoning, Requiem, grant them rest. Requiem aeternam, grant them eternal rest. And yet it's so reflective, it's so deeply personal. And when I rehearsed with the chorus the other night, we talked about that it has to be such that for each and every one of them, this is a very personal statement, and it can mean many, many different things to many different people. Now, the opposite side of the coin from a musical perspective, as I mentioned before, is the opening of the Dies Irae, the incredible sequence. It's actually a movement that lasts nearly 40 minutes with 10, 12 different very specific parts. But the very opening is one of the most dramatic pieces of music, and it proclaims immediately the power of this image of the Day of Wrath. And so Verdi kind of sets out these completely opposite poles. There's this very personal, very individual kind of opening, incredibly reflective, and this very, very powerful depiction of a Day of Wrath. Now, interestingly, in the course of the Dies Irae sequence, he brings to play numerous pieces utilizing the four soloists. And he really uses the four soloists as individual characters, as if they were characters in an opera. And they take on a very, very personal quality, and they bring to their respective texts, again, this very personal plea, sometimes ambiguous, sometimes very clear in its plea for eternal mercy, and yet it by the end of the entire piece, has left us in another place. If we could actually go over to the final movement, the Libera Me, and the opening of this movement, which has the solo soprano, it's literally taken from the ancient plain chant of just singing on a single note this text, Libera Me. chorus, almost in a whisper, intoning the same. Such a whisper you can barely hear. But again, raising this idea, this dichotomy between the individual and the many, and raising this eternal question: what is our individual place in the cosmos? I find it fascinating that Verdi, not really at all being a believer, and yet in the middle of this intensely Roman Catholic history and country, that he found a way through this text, through this music, through this history, to write a piece that transcends all of those aspects of it. You can get stuck in it as very much a requiem mass, but you can, as I think Verdi did, and as I think many people agree, myself included, that it is a piece that presents a much wider point of view and a focus for the power of an individual and the power of our collective unanimity to really pit ourselves against some of the most terrifying things of human existence. And that's where that connection comes into the 20th century. And of course, events like the Holocaust and the power of the human spirit that is shown through an event such as the Defiant Requiem.
I don't know a great deal about music, but I can tell you that the SS were all great music lovers. The event you will see depicted with the showing of the film surrounds one of the most iconic episodes of symbolic resistance in the history of the Holocaust. This performance by the orchestra in the Theresienstadt ghetto at the end of this great Potemkin-like faked tour that had been concocted for the Red Cross by the SS and the Gestapo, in which Adolf Eichmann had arranged for officials of the Swiss Red Cross, who had been trying for 4 years to get access to a camp where large numbers of Jews were held, and without success. And finally, to sort of get the Red Cross off their back, Eichmann agreed to this with the assent of his boss, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and the Swiss were brought in, and part of the tour that the Red Cross were given to see how well the Fuhrer was treating the Jews in Theresienstadt was to be this performance. I have heard it said by more than one knowledgeable historian that the quality of that orchestra at that time was probably greater than either the Berlin or the Vienna Philharmonic orchestras. Such was the presence of talent and ability and musical genius that was then present in Theresienstadt. And subsequent to this extraordinary act of defiance in the face of the worst of the SS killers, and in the presence of these officials from the Red Cross who really didn't have a clue as to what was being done, Eichmann, in a sense, I guess, to try to be a good sport, promised the Jewish elders in Theresienstadt that he would not break up this orchestra by deporting individual members from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. And Eichmann kept his promise. And in October of 1944, late October, early November 1944, he deported the entire orchestra to Auschwitz. And they all perished in the gas chambers of crematoria 2 or 3. Now, I don't know whether any of the orchestras at Auschwitz ever performed anything from Verdi or not. They did perform things that were favorites of the SS, and those included Mozart and Beethoven and the sort of standard litany of Prussian military marches and the the sort of light musical fare that you would find with things that would be performed in popular musical comedies and things like that of the day, as well as the standard routine of SA and SS marching music that was popular in that era. There were, as far as we know, inmate bands or orchestras in virtually all of the large or important German concentration camps: Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Stutthof, Natzweiler, Mauthausen. But all of these, in some way, ironically, were influenced by what developed with the musical life of the inmates at Auschwitz. Because Auschwitz, of course, became the great epicenter of the Holocaust. And it was also the largest facility in the war in which the Germans interned, either for slave labor or for some other purpose, eventually to result in their death. No inmate who was ever admitted to Auschwitz was intended to come out alive. Those Jews who survived the selection and were not immediately gassed upon arrival were intended to be worked to death as slave laborers with a life expectancy that usually didn't exceed more than 3 or 4 months. The Jews who did survive did so really as the most authentic miracles that come out of the Second World War. I wish I could at least include one uplifting note in this by telling you that large numbers of the people who were in these orchestras survived, but they didn't. Because in the end, even though the SS valued music and SS officers were fascinated by the talents of these men and women, their usefulness would be perceived as an end. The protection of them individually by SS men would be withdrawn. They would be cast into the cauldron of the rest of the inmate population, and most of them perished. A few did survive, but most did not, including the members of the orchestra at Theresienstadt, who performed this one great, almost incredible act of defiance right into the teeth of the worst of the SS murderers.